The first thing Daniel Cross noticed wasn't the storm, it was the silence that came after it, the kind of silence that didn't belong to nature, the kind that felt like something had been taken, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that hadn't ended yet, and standing there at the edge of his property with cold wind pressing against his face, Daniel realized something he hadn't felt in years, that quiet, dangerous instinct that had once kept him alive in places where most men didn't come back from, was awake again. The storm had arrived without warning 3 nights ago, violent in a way that didn't feel natural, tearing through the mountain region like it had a purpose, like it was hunting something hidden beneath the trees, and Daniel had watched it from inside his cabin, unmoving, unfazed on the surface, but inside, something had stirred, because storms like that reminded him of another kind of chaos, one made by men instead of nature, but just as ruthless, just as unforgiving. He hadn't slept much since. He never really did. But after the storm, it was worse. Because silence like this, it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Daniel adjusted the collar of his worn jacket and stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the mud as he scanned the tree line ahead, his eyes moving the way they always had, slow, precise, reading everything, missing nothing, even now, years after he'd left the life that trained him to do exactly that. Retired Navy SEAL. That's what people said. But Daniel knew the truth. You don't retire from something like that. You just stop wearing the uniform. The rest stays with you. Always. The forest stretched out in front of him, dense and dark, trees still dripping from the storm, broken branches scattered across the ground like bones after a fight, and there was something else too, something off. No birds. No movement. No life. It was wrong. Daniel stood still for a long moment, listening, letting the silence settle into him, trying to understand it, trying to decide if it was real or just his mind playing tricks the way it sometimes did when memories got too loud. Then he saw it. A flicker of movement between the trees. Fast. Low. Purposeful. Daniel's body reacted before his thoughts did, shoulders tightening slightly, weight shifting just enough to ground himself, eyes narrowing as the shape emerged from the shadows and stepped into the clearing. A German shepherd. Large. Lean. Covered in mud and rain. Its fur clung tightly to its body, darker than it should have been, and even from a distance Daniel could see the sharp outline of its ribs, the subtle signs of exhaustion, but none of that slowed it down. The dog moved with intent. Not wandering. Not searching. Heading somewhere. Daniel watched closely as it crossed the open space, its paws making almost no sound against the wet ground, its head low but focused, ears slightly back, eyes locked ahead like it knew exactly where it needed to go. And then something strange happened. The dog passed within 30 feet of him, and didn't even look his way. Not once. No hesitation. No curiosity. Nothing. It was like Daniel didn't exist. That alone was enough to put him on edge. Animals always noticed him. Always. They sensed something in him, something quiet but sharp, something that didn't belong in peaceful places. But this dog? It didn't care. Because whatever it was focused on, mattered more. Daniel turned slightly, tracking its movement as it disappeared back into the forest, heading toward the northern ridge, the area that had taken the worst of the storm damage. And just before it vanished completely, the dog slowed for a fraction of a second. Its head lifted. Its ears twitched. Like it heard something. Or sensed something. Then it was gone. Swallowed by the trees. Daniel stood there long after, staring into the space where it had disappeared, the wind brushing past him, carrying the damp scent of soil, broken wood, and something else. Something faint. Metallic. Unsettling. He exhaled slowly, forcing his body to relax, pushing the feeling down the way he had trained himself to do. Not your problem. That was the rule. Out here, alone, far from everything, that rule kept him sane. You don't go looking for things. You don't chase questions. You let the world be what it is, and you stay out of its way. Because every time he had ignored that rule before, it had cost him. Sometimes more than he could ever get back. Daniel turned and walked back toward his cabin, the wooden structure standing solid against the edge of the clearing, simple, quiet, built with his own hands years ago when he had decided he needed distance from everything, from people, from noise, from the constant weight of memories that didn't fade no matter how much time passed. Inside, the cabin was warm, but not comfortable. Nothing about Daniel's life was. A table. A chair. A bed. Everything clean. Everything in order. Because control was the only thing he had left. He poured himself a glass of water, his movement steady, deliberate, but his mind wasn't still. It kept returning to the dog. The way it moved. The way it ignored him. The direction it chose. Something about it didn't fit. And Daniel had learned a long time ago, when something doesn't fit, you don't ignore it. You remember it. You wait. And if it happens again, then you decide. That night, the wind picked up again, rattling the walls of the cabin softly, and Daniel sat in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the light, staring out through the window into the forest, his eyes adjusting to the shadows, searching without meaning to. Hours passed. Silence stretched. And just when he thought maybe he was imagining things, it came. A sound. Faint. Distant. But sharp enough to cut through everything else. A bark. One single bark. Then another. Not random. Not wild. Controlled. Directed. Calling. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he leaned forward, focusing, listening harder, his entire body still. The sound was coming from the northern ridge. The same direction the dog had gone. Another bark echoed through the trees, carried by the wind, and this time there was something in it that made something deep inside Daniel shift. Urgency. Not panic. Not fear. Something else. Something intentional. And then, silence again. Complete. Unnatural. Heavy. Daniel sat there for a long time after that, unmoving, his thoughts turning slowly, carefully, the way they used to when he was trying to decide whether to move forward, or stay back. Because once you step toward something like that, you don't always get to step away. And deep down, he already knew. If that dog came back again tomorrow, he wouldn't ignore it. And somewhere out in the darkness of that broken forest, something waited. Something that hadn't been buried by the storm. Something that had just made its presence known. And it wasn't finished yet. Morning came grey and cold, with a low sheet of cloud dragging across the mountains like smoke that had forgotten how to rise, and Daniel Cross was already awake before first light, sitting at the small table by the window with untouched coffee cooling in his hands, watching the edge of the clearing the way a man watches a door he knows someone will eventually walk through, not because he wants them to, but because something in him has already accepted that it will happen. He had spent the night half asleep and half submerged in the kind of dreams that were never really dreams at all, old sounds breaking through the dark, rotor blades, distant fire, a radio crackling in a language he no longer heard except in memory, and each time he woke, he heard that bark again in his mind, sharp and far away, carrying not panic but insistence, the sound of a creature trying to pull the world toward something it could not ignore. By sunrise he had made himself a promise he did not speak aloud. If the dog came back, he would follow. Not because he wanted trouble. Not because he believed in rescue missions anymore. But because there had been something in that sound the night before that crossed the distance between instinct and duty, and Daniel had learned the hard way that the most dangerous thing in the world was the call you knew was meant for you and chose to ignore anyway. Outside, the land still looked bruised. Broken limbs hung from trees at twisted angles. Mud glistened in deep tracks where water had ripped through the slope. Farther north, beyond his property line, the forest rose into the ridge where the storm had torn hardest, a black-green wall of pine and cedar with strips of raw earth exposed between the roots. Daniel stood on the porch for nearly 20 minutes, motionless except for the slow movement of his eyes, hearing little beyond the distant drip of water and the soft ticking of the cabin roof cooling from the night. Then, just as the weak morning light reached the clearing, the dog appeared again. It emerged from the eastern tree line this time, not from the north, as if it had spent the night circling and searching, and now that Daniel saw it more clearly he realized how much worse its condition really was. Its fur was matted thick with mud and burrs. There was a fresh cut high on one shoulder where the hair had clumped dark and stiff. One hind leg carried a slight hitch, not enough to slow it but enough to tell any careful observer that the animal was running on pain. Still it moved with the same focused determination, head low, body forward, every step direct. Daniel set the coffee down and stepped off the porch. The dog stopped. For the first time, it looked at him. The moment lasted only a second, maybe less, but it struck him harder than he expected. The shepherd's eyes were not wild. Not vacant. Not confused. They were alert, intelligent, watchful in the way of a working animal trained to measure risk and decide quickly. They held on him with a gravity that made the hair along the back of his neck rise, because he had seen that look before, in men, mostly, on operations, in those silent exchanges when words would only slow things down. The dog turned, took 3 steps toward the forest, stopped again, then looked back. Daniel did not move. The dog stared. Then it let out a single low bark. Not loud. Not threatening. Just enough. Daniel felt something old and unwelcome tighten behind his ribs. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, but his body was already making the decision his mind wanted to resist. He went inside, opened the cabinet by the door, and moved with the efficiency of a man whose preparation had become a kind of survival prayer. Waterproof shell. Field pack. Canteen. Flashlight. Rope. Compact trauma kit. Folding knife. Sidearm locked into the small of his back more from instinct than expectation. He hesitated at the rifle in the corner, then left it. If there was a human being out there hurt or trapped, the last thing they needed was the silhouette of a man coming through the woods carrying a long gun like a threat. He shut the door behind him and stepped into the cold. The dog was waiting at the edge of the clearing. As soon as Daniel approached, it pivoted and moved into the trees, not running, not sprinting, but maintaining a pace just fast enough to force him to keep up without losing sight of it. Daniel crossed his own boundary line and entered the forest. The first 100 yards were nothing but storm wreckage. The ground had been shredded. Branches lay in interlocking piles, forcing him to step high and angle sideways between trunks slick with rainwater. More than once he had to brace a hand against a fallen cedar to keep from sliding in the mud. The dog flowed through it with the unnatural grace of an animal built for terrain no human ever truly mastered, slipping under snapped limbs, leaping narrow washouts, slowing only when Daniel was forced to detour. It knew he was there. It was adjusting for him. That realization unsettled him more than anything yet. Not because it was impossible. Smart dogs did remarkable things. Military working dogs had saved lives alongside men in places where chaos ruled and mercy didn't exist. Daniel had trusted one once more than he trusted most people. But this felt different. More personal. Less like coincidence than intention. They climbed gradually toward the ridge, and as they did the forest changed. The damage grew worse. Whole sections of slope had slid away under the force of rain, exposing roots the thickness of a man's torso. One oak had split in half from top to bottom, the inside pale and raw as exposed bone. Daniel kept scanning as he moved, every old habit returning without permission. Disturbed soil. Broken branches at shoulder height. Tracks in the mud. Signs of recent passage. He found them soon enough, not only the dog's prints, which were obvious in the softer patches, but human boot marks, partly filled with water, moving north and then veering west toward a lower ravine. At first he crouched and studied them with the cool detachment of training. Then the details sharpened. Not hiking boots. Heavy tread. Civilian, maybe work boots. One set only. He stood slowly. The storm had passed 3 days earlier. If those tracks predated it, they would have been erased. These were newer. Recent enough to matter. The dog had stopped ahead, standing beside a snapped sapling, watching him. "You found someone," Daniel said, more to himself than to the animal. The shepherd gave no sign it understood the words, but when Daniel started forward again, it moved immediately, leading him off the ridge and into a narrow gully the storm had carved deeper than before. The air in there felt colder. Sound changed too. The forest hush above became something close and muffled, with water dripping from root webs overhead and the squelch of mud underfoot magnified by the steep banks. Daniel caught the metallic smell again. Stronger this time. Not enough to be sure, but enough to stir the part of him that catalogued danger before it appeared. Blood, his mind said. Or machinery. Or both. 10 minutes later the dog veered sharply left and pushed through a wall of young pine, emerging into a pocket of open ground where the storm had torn down several trees at once. Daniel stepped through after it and froze. An old pickup truck sat nose down between two broken trunks, half hidden under branches and torn brush like the forest had tried to swallow it. One tire was completely gone. The windshield had shattered inward. Mud covered the door so thickly that the original color was hard to make out, but along the driver's side Daniel could see deep gouges in the metal where something heavy had struck it during the storm. The dog ran straight to the passenger side and pawed frantically at the frame. Daniel approached slowly, every sense engaged. The truck was empty. No one inside. No body. No movement. But the glove compartment hung open, and scattered on the soaked seat were maps, a flashlight, an overturned thermos, and a child's red scarf darkened by rain. Daniel's face changed when he saw that scarf. Not with open emotion. He was a man who had long ago lost the habit of letting feeling reach the surface too quickly. But something moved in his eyes, something old and painful. He looked away, scanning the ground. There were signs of struggle here, not violent, not obvious, but confusing enough to be wrong. Human footprints led away from the truck in more than one direction, some partially smeared by water and mud. One track showed a drag mark, shallow and intermittent, as though someone injured had been helped or pulled for a short distance. He circled once, then crouched by the rear wheel well and found what he had smelled before, blood. Dried into the metal in a dark streak protected from the rain by the overhang. Not much. But enough. The dog whined, a low vibrating sound deep in its chest, then ran a few yards into the trees and came back, then ran again. Daniel stood. "All right," he said quietly. "Show me." The shepherd lunged forward, and Daniel followed into thicker cover. The trail from there became harder. Whoever had left the truck had moved through chaos. Branches, runoff, and sliding mud had scrambled the ground. But every few yards the dog would stop, nose working fast, then angle a few degrees and continue, threading together a path only it could fully read. Daniel stayed close, and with every minute he spent behind the animal, the sense of being led deepened into certainty. This was not blind wandering. The dog knew what it was doing. Twice Daniel found scraps that confirmed it, a strip of torn rain jacket caught on bark, a dropped battery, then farther down the slope the clean outline of a small handprint in a patch of silt where someone had braced against a rock. Small. Too small for an adult. He stared at it. The forest seemed to go even quieter around him. A child. The thought landed with a force he had not prepared for. He looked ahead at the dog and suddenly everything changed. This wasn't just a stray returning to some hidden place. This was a dog trying to lead him to someone who might still be alive. The path descended into a ravine where storm water had pooled in black still patches between rocks. Daniel's boots sank ankle-deep more than once, cold mud seeping over the soles, but he didn't slow. His breathing stayed controlled. His thoughts narrowed. The old operating mode returned, not because he welcomed it, but because the situation demanded it. Distance. Terrain. Time since storm. Blood evidence. Child present. Unknown adult condition. Unknown threat level. He moved through the calculations automatically. Ahead, the dog stopped so abruptly that Daniel nearly walked into it. The shepherd's ears came up. Its body stiffened. Not fear. Alert. Daniel dropped into a half-crouch, hand instinctively near the pistol at his back, and listened. At first he heard only water dripping from leaves. Then something else, a sound so faint he thought he imagined it. A creak. Metal under tension. He scanned the ravine and saw it to his right, a section of old utility line dragged down by the storm, tangled through branches and half buried in mud, still attached somewhere up the slope where a pole leaned at an impossible angle. Not live, he guessed, but dangerous all the same. One bad step and the whole mess could shift. The dog glanced back at him, then carefully skirted wide around it. Daniel did the same. 10 yards later they found the first sign that something much darker had happened out here. It was a campsite, or what had once been one. A small dome tent lay shredded under a fallen limb. A cooler had burst open, its contents scattered and spoiled. There were 2 folding chairs, one crushed flat. Beside a fire ring drowned in rainwater, a backpack lay on its side with coloring books spilled into the mud. Daniel approached slowly, every nerve tightening. Family gear. Civilian. Unprepared for a storm of this scale. He crouched and picked up a page from the mud, a child's drawing blurred by water until all that remained clear was a house, a stick-figure girl, and a large dog colored in dark pencil beside her. He stared at it longer than he meant to. When he set it down, his hand was not quite steady. The dog moved past the campsite and nosed at the ground beyond. Daniel forced himself back into motion, but now a heaviness had entered him that had nothing to do with the pack or the climb. He knew this feeling. It was the feeling before bad news was confirmed, the feeling when hope still existed but had begun to thin into something fragile. The trail bent toward a stand of birch near the base of a rock wall where storm debris had piled high. The dog quickened, weaving through the trunks, then stopped at the mouth of a narrow space between 2 boulders half hidden under brush. It barked once, loud enough to startle a flock of birds into sudden flight somewhere overhead. Daniel pushed through the branches and saw what the animal had found. At first he could not make sense of the shape in the dark. Then his eyes adjusted. Someone had created a makeshift shelter there using a torn tarp, branches, and the wreckage of camping gear wedged against the stone. Inside, curled beneath it and barely visible under 2 soaked blankets, was a little girl. For one impossible second Daniel thought he was too late. She lay so still, face pale beneath streaks of dirt, dark hair plastered to her forehead, one small arm tucked under her chest like she had fallen asleep trying to stay warm. Then the dog nosed under the edge of the tarp and gave a soft, urgent whine, and the girl's fingers moved. Daniel was on his knees in an instant. "Hey," he said, voice low and steady, the way medics had once spoken to men bleeding in dust and darkness. "Hey, sweetheart. Stay with me." Her eyes fluttered, half opened, then closed again. She couldn't have been older than 8. 9 at most. Her lips were cracked. Her breathing was shallow but there. Alive. Alive. Daniel swallowed hard and opened his trauma kit with hands that now moved faster than thought. Hypothermia first. Check pupils. Check pulse. Look for major bleeding. Her pulse was weak and rapid. Skin cold. Right ankle swollen badly, maybe sprained or fractured. Minor cuts on hands and face. No obvious head wound, but exhaustion and exposure had pushed her close to the edge. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket from his kit, adding his own shell over the top. The dog pressed close against her side immediately, sharing warmth without being told, eyes fixed on Daniel the whole time as if measuring whether this stranger would truly help. "Good dog," Daniel murmured, and the words hit him with unexpected force because he had not spoken them in years, not since another life, another dog, another mission that ended in fire and smoke and the kind of guilt that never completely loosened its grip. The little girl's eyes opened a second time, wider now, unfocused and frightened. "Molly," she whispered. Daniel looked at the shepherd. So that was her name, or maybe the dog's. "She's here," he said. "You okay? I've got you." The child blinked slowly, trying to find his face through the haze. Mama said, "Stay hidden." The words came in broken breaths. Men, in the woods. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs one measured inch at a time. He leaned closer. What men? But the girl was already slipping again, consciousness falling away like a light sinking under water. The dog's ears lifted sharply toward the ravine behind them. A split second later Daniel heard it too. Not storm noise. Not animals. Footsteps. More than one set. Coming through the trees, Daniel Cross didn't move for a fraction of a second, but inside him everything locked into place with terrifying clarity, the kind of clarity that only came from years spent in situations where hesitation meant death, and as the faint but unmistakable rhythm of approaching footsteps filtered through the broken forest, the world around him seemed to narrow into a single, sharp line between survival and disaster, and he knew instantly, whoever was coming, they were not rescuers. He pressed one hand gently against the girl's shoulder, feeling the weak but steady rise of her breathing beneath the thermal wrap, and his eyes shifted to the German shepherd, whose entire body had gone rigid, ears forward, muscles coiled with a quiet readiness that mirrored his own, and in that silent exchange something passed between them, something primal and absolute, a shared understanding that neither of them could afford to be wrong. Daniel leaned close to the girl, his voice low and steady, almost a whisper carried only inches. "Stay quiet," he said, though he knew she might not even hear him fully, her consciousness flickering at the edge, her small body already pushed beyond what it should have endured, and then he moved. Fast, precise, controlled. He slid her carefully deeper into the makeshift shelter, pulling the torn tarp down just enough to obscure her outline without cutting off airflow. Then he grabbed a handful of mud and smeared it across the exposed silver of his gear, dulling anything that might catch light, his mind running calculations with ruthless efficiency, distance, terrain, angles, timing. The footsteps were closer now. At least 3. Maybe more. Heavy boots, uneven spacing, moving without concern for noise, which told him something critical: they didn't think anyone was out here to hear them. That meant they believed they were alone. That meant they didn't expect resistance. Daniel rose slowly, keeping low, his hand brushing the grip of the sidearm at his back but not drawing it yet, because the moment you pull a weapon, you change the situation from uncertain to committed, and he needed information first. The German shepherd shifted beside him, stepping slightly ahead, placing itself between Daniel and the direction of the sound, not aggressively, not recklessly, but protectively. Instinct layered over intelligence in a way that made Daniel's chest tighten with a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years: trust. "Easy," he whispered, and the dog's ears flicked back just slightly, acknowledging him, but it did not retreat. It held position. The forest ahead began to move. Branches pushed aside. Shapes forming between the trees. Daniel slid sideways behind a thick trunk, using it as cover, lowering his profile, slowing his breathing until it became almost imperceptible, and then he saw them. 3 men. Maybe 4, the last one partially obscured by the others. Civilian clothing, but not hikers. Not locals. Their movements were wrong. Too deliberate in some ways, too careless in others. One carried a rifle slung across his chest, not in a way that suggested hunting, but readiness. Another held a flashlight even though it was daylight, sweeping it lazily across the ground as if searching for something specific. The third walked slightly behind, scanning less, but watching more, the kind of man who let others do the work while he evaluated the results. Daniel's eyes locked onto that third man for half a second longer than the others. Leader. Or at least the one who mattered most. "Tracks went this way," the man with the flashlight said, his voice rough, impatient. "She didn't get far. Kid's injured." Daniel's pulse slowed, not quickened, a controlled drop into the state he used to call the quiet, where everything unnecessary fell away and only the essential remained. They were talking about the girl. Which meant they had been following her. Which meant whatever had happened out here wasn't just an accident of the storm. The man with the rifle shifted, stepping over a fallen branch, his boot landing inches from one of the faint drag marks Daniel had noticed earlier. "We should have finished it back at the truck," he muttered. "Storm gave us cover." The leader didn't respond immediately. He crouched slightly, examining the ground, then reached down and touched something Daniel couldn't see clearly from his angle. When he stood again, his expression was colder than before. "Blood's fresh enough," he said quietly. "She's close." The German shepherd's body tensed further, a low vibration building in its chest, barely audible, but enough that Daniel felt it more than heard it, and in that moment he realized something that shifted everything again: the dog wasn't just leading him to the girl. It was protecting her. It had been staying near, circling, returning, searching, and now it was ready to defend. Daniel's jaw tightened. He leaned slightly closer to the tree, adjusting his angle, counting distance. 15 yards. Maybe less. Too close for comfort. Too close for mistakes. He could try to slip away with the girl, but her condition wouldn't allow fast movement. He could try to hide and hope they passed, but the men were tracking, and sooner or later they would find the shelter. Which left one option he hadn't wanted to consider. Confrontation. He exhaled slowly, grounding himself in the moment, pushing aside everything else, the past, the memories, the promises he had made to himself about never going back to this kind of situation again, because right now, none of that mattered. There was a child behind him. Injured. Vulnerable. And men who had already shown they were willing to let her die. The equation was simple. Daniel shifted his weight slightly, preparing, when suddenly one of the men stopped. "Wait," he said. The others froze. Silence dropped heavy over the space. The man tilted his head, listening. Daniel felt it too. Something had changed. Not in the men. In the forest. The kind of shift you couldn't explain, only feel, like the moment before something breaks. The man with the flashlight frowned. "What?" The first man didn't answer immediately. His eyes scanned the trees, slower now, more careful. Then he spoke, quieter than before. "We're not alone." Daniel's muscles tightened. He hadn't made a sound. He knew he hadn't. But men like this, sometimes they felt things the same way he did. Instinct recognizing instinct. The leader straightened, his posture shifting subtly, no longer casual. "Spread out," he said. 10 meters. "Watch your angles." The formation changed instantly. More disciplined now. More dangerous. Daniel felt a cold edge slide through his chest. These weren't just random criminals. They had training. Not necessarily military, but enough to be a real problem. The distance between them and the shelter shrank as they began to fan out, each step bringing them closer to the girl's hiding place, and Daniel knew he had seconds now, not minutes. He glanced once toward the tarp-covered space behind him, then at the German shepherd. The dog's eyes met his, steady, unflinching. Ready. Daniel made his decision. He reached slowly behind his back and drew the sidearm, keeping it low, controlled, not yet visible, then shifted his position just enough to create a new angle, one that would force the nearest man into his line if he took 2 more steps. One of the men moved closer. Too close. His boot crunched softly on a broken branch, and he leaned forward slightly, peering into the undergrowth where the shelter was hidden. Another step. Daniel's finger settled against the trigger, not pulling, just resting, waiting for the exact moment when hesitation would become fatal. The man took that step. And in that instant, the German shepherd exploded forward. It didn't bark. It didn't warn. It launched from stillness into motion with a force and speed that stunned even Daniel, slamming into the man's chest before he could react, knocking him backward into the mud as a shout tore from his throat, and the forest shattered into chaos. "What the?" someone yelled, but the words cut off as Daniel moved, stepping out from cover with lethal precision, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Don't move." The command was sharp, absolute, carrying the weight of authority that didn't come from volume but from certainty, and for a fraction of a second, it worked. The men froze, their attention snapping toward him, confusion colliding with instinct, and in that heartbeat of hesitation, Daniel saw everything, the rifle not yet raised, the angles of their bodies, the distance between them, the way the leader's eyes sharpened as he processed the threat. Too fast. Too experienced. "Drop it," Daniel said, his aim steady, voice calm but unyielding. The man with the rifle began to lift it. Daniel fired. The shot cracked through the forest, deafening in the confined space, the bullet striking the ground inches from the man's foot, spraying dirt and mud upward. A warning. Precise. Intentional. Next one hit center, Daniel said, and this time there was no room for interpretation. Silence fell again, but it was different now, tight, charged, ready to snap. The German Shepherd stood over the man it had taken down, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating through its body, daring him to move. The leader slowly raised his hands, not in surrender, but in calculation. "You don't want this," he said. Daniel's eyes didn't leave him. "You're right," he replied quietly. "But you're going to walk away from here? Now?" For a moment, it looked like the situation might hold, balanced on the edge of control. Then the man on the ground moved. Fast. Reaching. And everything broke. The moment the man on the ground reached, everything snapped from fragile control into raw, violent motion, the kind Daniel Cross knew all too well, where time didn't slow, it sharpened, every detail cutting clean and precise, and before the man's hand even closed around whatever he was reaching for, Daniel fired again, this time not as a warning, the shot cracking through the ravine with brutal finality as the bullet struck the dirt beside the man's arm hard enough to jolt him back, but it wasn't enough to stop what came next because the others were already moving, instincts overriding hesitation, survival kicking in with dangerous speed. The man with the rifle swung it up, faster now, abandoning caution, and Daniel shifted his stance, firing once more, this time striking the weapon itself, the impact jerking it sideways as the man cursed and stumbled back, his grip broken, but the forest had already erupted into chaos, boots slamming into mud, branches snapping, voices shouting over each other in confusion and anger. The German Shepherd didn't retreat. It lunged again, snapping inches from the fallen man's face, forcing him flat, pinning him with nothing but presence and the promise of violence if he moved again, its growl deep and relentless, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and unyielding. Daniel moved left, never staying still, keeping the tree between himself and the widest angle, his training guiding every step without conscious thought, his mind mapping threats, adjusting, predicting. "Back off," he barked, his voice cutting through the noise again, but this time the men weren't freezing, they were recalculating. The leader's eyes locked onto Daniel, cold and focused now, no trace of uncertainty left. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," he said, his tone low, controlled, dangerous. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The answer was already written in the way he stood, the way he held the weapon, the way his eyes never left theirs. The man with the damaged rifle recovered faster than expected, dropping the useless weapon and reaching for something at his side, another firearm, smaller, concealed. Daniel saw it a fraction of a second before it cleared the holster. He fired. The shot struck the man's shoulder, spinning him sideways into the mud with a sharp cry, the weapon flying from his hand as he hit the ground hard, and suddenly the balance shifted. Not fully. Not safely. But enough. "I said back off," Daniel repeated, quieter now, but far more dangerous, because the restraint was gone. The remaining men froze again, but this time it wasn't hesitation, it was calculation under pressure, their options narrowing rapidly as they realized they were no longer dealing with an unarmed civilian or a lost hiker, but someone who knew exactly how to end this if pushed further. The leader's gaze flicked briefly to the man on the ground, then to the injured one clutching his shoulder, then back to Daniel. "You think you're protecting her," he said slowly, "but you're just delaying what's already decided." Daniel's grip didn't change. "Walk away," he said. The words were simple. Absolute. Final. For a long second, the forest held its breath again, the tension thick enough to feel, the kind of moment where everything could tip in either direction with a single wrong move, and then, the leader made a choice. He lowered his hands slowly, not in surrender, but in acceptance of the situation as it stood. "This isn't over," he said quietly. Daniel didn't blink. "It is for you," he replied. The man held his gaze for another second, then turned, signaling the others with a slight motion of his head, and one by one they began to retreat, dragging the injured man with them, moving carefully but quickly, disappearing back into the trees the way they had come, their presence fading but not gone, not truly. Daniel didn't move for a long moment after they vanished. He stayed exactly where he was, weapon still raised, listening, counting, tracking every sound, every shift in the forest, waiting for any sign they might circle back or try something else. The German Shepherd remained over the downed man until he was fully out of sight, then slowly stepped back, its body still tense, ears flicking, eyes scanning. Only when the silence settled again did Daniel lower the weapon slightly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the calm didn't last. Because now there were questions. Bigger ones. The girl. The men. The truck. This wasn't random. This wasn't an accident. Something had happened out here, something deliberate, something dangerous, and he had just stepped directly into it. He turned quickly, moving back toward the shelter, his focus shifting instantly from threat to survival. The girl was still where he had left her, her breathing shallow but steady, her small body wrapped tightly in the layers he had given her, the German Shepherd following close behind him, immediately returning to her side, pressing in gently as if checking that she was still there, still alive. Daniel knelt beside her again, his hands moving with practiced precision, checking her pulse, her temperature, her responsiveness. She stirred slightly, her eyelids fluttering, a faint sound escaping her lips. "It's okay," Daniel said softly, his voice changing completely now, the edge gone, replaced by something steadier, something almost unfamiliar. "They're gone." Her eyes opened just a little, unfocused, searching. "Mama," she whispered. The word hit harder than anything that had just happened. Daniel swallowed, forcing himself to stay focused. "We're going to get you out of here," he said. "But I need you to stay with me, all right?" She didn't answer. She was slipping again, her strength too low to hold onto consciousness for long. Daniel glanced at the dog. "Molly," he said quietly. The German Shepherd's ears perked at the name, its eyes lifting to meet his, and there it was again, that understanding, that connection that felt almost human in its depth. "You brought me to her," Daniel murmured. "Good girl." The dog leaned slightly into the girl, pressing warmth into her side, refusing to leave even for a second. Daniel looked around, assessing quickly. They couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after what had just happened. Those men would regroup. They would come back. And next time, they wouldn't underestimate him. He had maybe an hour. Maybe less. He slid one arm carefully under the girl, lifting her slowly, supporting her head and shoulders, feeling how light she was, how fragile, how close she had come to not making it at all, and something inside him tightened again, something old and heavy, something he had buried for years because it hurt too much to carry. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "We move." The German Shepherd stepped back just enough to give him space, but stayed close, almost glued to his side as he stood, adjusting the girl's weight carefully, securing her against his chest in a position that would keep her as stable and warm as possible while still allowing him to move quickly if needed. He took one last look at the shelter, at the broken campsite beyond, at the direction the men had gone, and then he turned, heading back the way they had come, every step measured, every sense alert. The forest felt different now. Not just damaged. Not just quiet. Watching. Waiting. And as Daniel moved through it with the girl in his arms and the German Shepherd at his side, one thought settled heavily in his mind, one he couldn't ignore no matter how much he wanted to. This wasn't over. Not even close. And somewhere out there, beyond the broken trees and the fading storm, those men were already planning their next move. The weight of the girl in Daniel Cross's arms was almost nothing compared to what he had carried in other places, other times, but this felt heavier in a way that had nothing to do with muscle or endurance, because every fragile breath she took pressed against something buried deep inside him, something he had spent years trying to forget. And as he moved carefully through the broken forest with the German Shepherd pacing silently at his side, he could feel the past beginning to rise again, uninvited, unwelcome, but impossible to ignore now that he had stepped back into the kind of situation he had sworn never to enter again. The forest seemed tighter on the return path, every snapped branch and muddy slope more dangerous now that he carried someone who couldn't afford a fall, and Daniel adjusted his pace, slower but still efficient, his boots finding stable ground where there was any, shifting his weight to protect the girl's injured leg, keeping her as still as possible despite the terrain. The dog stayed close, too close for coincidence, its body brushing his leg occasionally as if maintaining contact, its head constantly turning, scanning, listening, tracking every subtle shift in the environment like a second pair of eyes that never blinked. Daniel glanced down at it once. "You don't leave her, do you?" he murmured. The German Shepherd didn't respond with movement or sound, but something in the way it stayed aligned with him made the answer clear. No. It didn't leave. It wouldn't leave. They climbed out of the ravine slowly, Daniel's breathing steady but deeper now, the effort building, mud clinging to his boots, trying to drag him down with every step, but he didn't stop, didn't hesitate, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking right now would open doors he didn't want to open. Still, the thoughts came anyway. The girl's voice. Mama said stay hidden. Men in the woods. That wasn't fear talking. That was instruction. Which meant whoever had been with her, her mother, most likely, had known those men were coming. Had known enough to hide her child instead of running together. That meant planning. Awareness. Maybe even a history with them. This wasn't a random encounter. Daniel reached the edge of the campsite again, slowing slightly as he stepped around the scattered debris, his eyes scanning automatically for anything new, any sign the men had returned or left something behind, but everything looked the same, destroyed, abandoned, silent. Too silent. He moved past it, continuing toward the ridge, but just as he cleared the last of the fallen trees, the German Shepherd stopped abruptly. Daniel halted instantly, shifting his stance to keep balance while holding the girl, his eyes snapping toward the dog. It wasn't growling this time. It wasn't aggressive. It was listening. Then slowly, it turned its head toward a different direction. Not the path back to the cabin. Not the way they had come. West. Daniel followed its gaze, his instincts tightening again. What is it? He whispered. The dog stepped away from him slightly, then looked back, then moved again, a few steps into the trees, stopping, waiting. Not abandoning. Not panicking. Guiding. Daniel frowned. No, he said under his breath. We go back. The dog didn't move further. It stood there, watching him, that same steady, intelligent gaze, and for a second Daniel felt something unfamiliar, uncertainty. Because this wasn't random behavior. This was deliberate. And it didn't make sense. Unless, there was something else. Something he hadn't seen yet. The girl shifted weakly in his arms, a soft sound escaping her lips, and Daniel's focus snapped back. She came first. Always. He turned, starting forward again toward the ridge path that would take them home, but after 3 steps, he stopped. Because the dog hadn't followed. Daniel looked back. The German Shepherd stood exactly where he had left it, still watching him, still waiting, and then it let out a single, low bark. Not loud. Not urgent. But firm. Daniel stared at it for a long second, the tension building slowly in his chest, because this felt like a choice, and he hated choices like this, the ones where every option carried risk, where instinct pulled in 2 directions at once. Get the girl to safety. That was priority. But the dog had already led him to her. Had saved her life. And now it was trying to lead him somewhere else. Damn it, Daniel muttered, closing his eyes briefly, thinking fast, weighing time, distance, probability. If there was another survivor. If there was something else connected to this, walking away now might mean losing it forever. He opened his eyes again, looking at the dog. 5 minutes, he said quietly. That's all. The German Shepherd turned immediately, as if it had been waiting for that exact decision, and moved deeper into the trees, faster this time, but not too fast, always checking back, always keeping him within sight. Daniel adjusted the girl in his arms and followed, every step sharper now, more alert, because whatever the dog was leading him to, it mattered. The terrain shifted again as they moved west, the ground rising slightly, less mud but more debris, broken trunks forming jagged barriers, forcing him to take longer routes, each second stretching his patience thinner, his mind constantly reminding him that time was running out, that those men could be circling back even now. Then he saw it. A structure. Small. Half hidden between the trees. At first he thought it was just another piece of storm wreckage, but as he got closer, the shape became clearer, a cabin. Old. Weathered. Not like his. This one had been here a long time, its wood grey and worn, its windows dark, one shutter hanging loose, creaking softly in the wind. Daniel slowed, his instincts screaming now, every sense on edge. "Stay close," he whispered, though he knew the dog already was. The German Shepherd moved ahead slightly, approaching the cabin with caution, not rushing, not charging, its body low, ears forward, reading the space the way Daniel was. The door was partially open. Not broken. Just open. Daniel shifted the girl carefully, freeing one hand, his fingers tightening slightly as he stepped. The forest did not forgive weight, and as Daniel moved through it carrying two fragile lives balanced on a broken door, every step became a negotiation between strength and failure, between control and collapse, the stretcher shifting slightly with each uneven patch of ground, the mud gripping his boots like it wanted to pull him under. But he didn't stop, didn't even allow the thought of stopping to form, because the moment you paused in a situation like this, you lost momentum, and momentum was the only thing keeping them alive. Molly stayed tight at his left side, not drifting, not wandering, her presence constant, her ears flicking at every sound, her nose working the air as if reading invisible lines written into the wind, and more than once Daniel felt her brush against his leg just enough to remind him she was there, not for comfort, but for alignment, for coordination, as if they were already moving as a unit instead of man and animal. The ridge climb hit harder on the return, the incline steeper than it had seemed on the way down, his muscles burning under the strain as he adjusted his grip again, redistributing weight, his breathing controlled but heavier now, and behind him, the forest began to speak again, not loudly, not clearly, but enough. A branch snapping in the distance. A faint echo of voices carried thin by the wind. Not close yet. But closer than before. They were coming back. Faster this time. More careful. Daniel didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He could feel it in the air, in the tension that seemed to tighten around every tree, every shadow stretching longer than it should under the dim light filtering through the clouds. Almost there, he muttered under his breath, though the words were more for himself than for the unconscious bodies on the stretcher, a way to anchor the moment, to keep moving forward when everything in his body wanted to slow down, to rest, to reassess. He crested the ridge and immediately shifted direction, not following the exact path they had taken earlier, but angling slightly east, using terrain to his advantage, breaking line of sight, minimizing predictable movement patterns, the kind of adjustments that came from years of operating in places where being predictable got you killed. Molly adapted instantly, matching his new path without hesitation, her pace adjusting, her attention splitting between the trail ahead and the sounds behind them. Daniel risked a quick glance back. Nothing visible yet. But the forest wasn't empty anymore. He could feel it. The descent toward his cabin was slower, more dangerous with the added weight, and twice he nearly lost footing on loose mud, catching himself at the last second, his grip tightening hard enough to make his knuckles pale, but the stretcher held, the makeshift bindings doing their job, the girl and her mother shifting only slightly before settling again. The woman stirred once, a faint groan escaping her lips, her consciousness flickering just enough to register movement, pain, fear, and Daniel spoke immediately, his voice low but firm. "Stay still. You're safe." She didn't respond, but her breathing steadied slightly, and that was enough. He kept moving. The trees began to thin. The clearing was close. His cabin just beyond. Safety. Temporary, fragile, but real. Then Molly stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Daniel halted with her, his entire body tightening again as the silence shifted, the air changing in a way that didn't need explanation. He followed her gaze. And saw them. Not behind. Ahead. Two figures, emerging from the tree line near the edge of his clearing, moving cautiously, scanning the area, weapons drawn now, no more carelessness, no more underestimation. They had anticipated him. Cut him off. Daniel's pulse dropped again, not rising, his mind snapping into that cold, focused state where emotion had no place, only action. He slowly lowered the stretcher to the ground, keeping it stable, careful not to jolt the woman's wound or the girl's injured leg, his movements deliberate, controlled, and Molly shifted immediately, stepping forward, placing herself between the stretcher and the approaching men, her body low, silent, ready. Daniel straightened, his hand moving to the sidearm, drawing it smoothly, his eyes locking onto the two figures ahead. Distance, 25 yards. Maybe less. Limited cover. Open ground. Not ideal. Not survivable if handled wrong. The men hadn't seen him yet. Their focus was on the cabin. Searching. Expecting. Daniel's mind moved fast. If he engaged now, he might take one down. Maybe both. But gunfire would draw the others. And he didn't know how many were still out there. If he retreated, tried to circle back, he risked being flanked. The girl. The woman. They couldn't move fast enough. There was no perfect option. Only less bad ones. Molly glanced back at him briefly, just for a second, and in that look there was no fear, no confusion, just readiness. Daniel exhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Stay," he whispered. The dog didn't move. He stepped forward, just enough to clear the stretcher, just enough to take a better angle, his weapon low but ready, his body aligned, balanced, and then one of the men turned. Their eyes met. The moment stretched, sharp and silent. Then everything broke again. The man raised his weapon. Daniel fired first. The shot cracked across the clearing, striking the man's leg, dropping him instantly with a shout, and the second man spun toward the sound, bringing his weapon up, firing blindly toward Daniel's position, bullets tearing through bark and dirt as Daniel dropped low, moving fast, using the nearest tree as cover, his movements fluid, precise, every inch calculated. Molly didn't stay back. She moved. Not toward the gunfire, but toward the flank, circling wide, using the terrain the way Daniel had taught himself to do years ago, her body disappearing into the brush, silent, fast, purposeful. The injured man on the ground tried to crawl, dragging himself toward cover, but he was too exposed, too slow, and Daniel shifted position, tracking the second man now, who was moving laterally, trying to gain angle, trying to outmaneuver him. They were trained. Not perfect. But trained enough to be dangerous. Another shot rang out, closer this time, a bullet striking the tree inches from Daniel's shoulder, splintering wood into the air, and he moved again, not staying in one place long enough to be targeted, his breathing steady, his mind clear, the world narrowing to movement, angles, timing. Then, a blur of motion from the side. Molly. She hit the second man from his blind angle, slamming into him with full force, knocking his aim off as the shot fired harmlessly into the sky, and Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped out, closing the distance just enough, his voice cutting through the chaos again. "Drop it." The man struggled, trying to push the dog off, but Molly held, her grip precise, controlled, not killing, but not letting go either, her training, whether formal or instinctive, guiding her perfectly. The man froze. Weapon still in hand. Breathing hard. Eyes darting between Daniel and the dog. "Drop it," Daniel repeated, quieter now, but far more dangerous. Slowly, the man let the weapon fall. It hit the ground with a dull thud. Silence followed. Thick. Heavy. Broken only by the labored breathing of the injured man still trying to move on the ground. Daniel stepped forward carefully, his weapon still trained, his eyes never leaving the man standing in front of him, and for a moment, everything held again. Then a sound cut through the air from behind the trees. More footsteps. More voices. Closer now. Reinforcements. Daniel's jaw tightened. This wasn't over. Not even close. And this time, there was no clean way out. The sound of more men moving through the forest didn't echo this time, it pressed in, thick and immediate, like the storm had returned in human form, closing distance fast, and Daniel Cross felt the window of control slam shut in his mind with absolute clarity, because whatever advantage he had just gained, it was already dissolving. He didn't hesitate. "Molly, back," he snapped, and the German shepherd released instantly, springing away from the man she had pinned, retreating to Daniel's side without looking back, her obedience sharp and immediate, her eyes already scanning for the next threat as if she understood that the situation had shifted again, more dangerous than before. Daniel stepped forward in one controlled motion and kicked the dropped weapon away, sending it skidding across the clearing, then grabbed the man by the collar and shoved him hard toward the wounded one on the ground. "Stay down," he said, His voice low and lethal, the kind of tone that didn't invite defiance, only survival, and for a second, the man hesitated, then complied, dropping to his knees beside his injured partner, both of them now reduced from hunters to liabilities in the middle of a situation that had turned against them. But there was no time to secure them. No time to question. No time for anything but movement. The voices were closer now, 3, maybe 4 more, crashing through the trees without subtlety, no longer concerned with stealth, only speed. They had heard the shots. They knew exactly where to go. Daniel turned, already moving back toward the stretcher, his mind calculating with brutal efficiency, distance to cabin, 15 seconds under normal conditions, now maybe 25 with weight, time before visual contact, less than 10 seconds, options, limited, dangerous, none ideal. He reached the stretcher, dropping to one knee for a fraction of a second to check the girl and her mother, both still alive, both still breathing, barely, but enough, and then he grabbed the front grips again, lifting with controlled force, his muscles screaming in protest now but obeying anyway, because pain was irrelevant, because failure wasn't an option he allowed himself to consider. Go, he muttered, more command than suggestion, and Molly surged forward immediately, moving ahead of him toward the cabin, clearing the path, checking angles, her body low and fast through the broken terrain. Daniel followed, each step heavy but deliberate, the stretcher swaying slightly with the uneven ground, forcing him to adjust constantly, to compensate, to keep balance while still maintaining speed, and behind him, the forest exploded. Shouts. Boots. Branches snapping violently as the new group pushed through the trees, no longer hidden, no longer cautious, and then the first shot cracked through the air, a bullet striking the ground behind Daniel, sending dirt spraying up in a sharp burst. They were firing now. Not warning shots. Not hesitation. Intent to stop him. Daniel didn't look back. He couldn't. Looking back slowed you down, broke rhythm, cost seconds, and seconds were everything right now. Another shot. Closer. A tree to his right splintered, bark exploding outward as the round struck hard, and Daniel angled slightly left, changing trajectory just enough to disrupt their aim without losing momentum, his breathing now a controlled burn in his chest, his legs pushing harder than they should have been able to after everything they had already done. The cabin came into view. 10 yards. 8. Molly reached it first, circling once, then positioning herself at the door, waiting, watching, ready. Daniel hit the clearing, boots slipping slightly in the mud but recovering instantly, driving forward, closing the last distance with everything he had left, and just as another shot cracked behind him, he crossed the threshold, dragging the stretcher inside in one fluid motion. Inside, he barked, though no one else could respond, and Molly followed instantly, slipping through the doorway just as Daniel slammed it shut behind them, throwing the bolt across with a sharp, final click. Silence lasted exactly 1 second. Then the impact hit. Something heavy slammed into the door from outside, not breaking it, but testing it, followed by voices, angry now, louder, closer. He's inside, one of them shouted. Daniel didn't waste a second. He dropped the stretcher carefully to the floor, immediately moving to the nearest window, scanning the perimeter, counting, tracking. For men visible. Maybe more behind the trees. Weapons drawn. Spreading out. Surrounding. He turned back quickly, grabbing a chair and wedging it under the door handle, reinforcing the lock, then moved to the second window, checking angles, exits, options. Limited. Very limited. The cabin was solid, but not built for a siege. Not built to withstand sustained gunfire. Damn it, he muttered, running through scenarios, each one worse than the last. Molly stood near the stretcher, her body tense, her eyes locked on the door, every muscle ready, but she didn't bark, didn't panic, she held, steady, focused, the way a trained partner would in the middle of a fight. Daniel looked at her for a brief second, and something passed through him, recognition, respect, something deeper than either. Stay with them, he said quietly, and she didn't hesitate, shifting closer to the girl and her mother, placing herself between them and the door, a living shield without needing to be told why. Outside, footsteps moved along the walls, testing, probing, looking for weak points. A shadow passed across the window. Another voice, calmer, controlled, the leader. You can't stay in there forever, he called out. Daniel didn't respond. He moved to the back of the cabin, scanning again, and that's when he saw it. The rear window. Smaller. Partially hidden by brush outside. An exit. Risky. But possible. He moved quickly back to the stretcher, dropping to one knee again, his voice low but urgent as he leaned toward the woman, who had drifted back into semi-consciousness. Listen to me, he said. Her eyes flickered open weakly. We don't have much time. I'm getting you out the back. She tried to shake her head, but barely managed it. They'll see, Daniel's gaze hardened. Not if we move fast enough. The girl stirred slightly, her small hand shifting weakly against the blanket, and Molly lowered her head, pressing gently against her side, grounding her, keeping her there. Outside, something hit the side of the cabin, hard. A test. Maybe a warning. Maybe the start of something worse. Daniel stood, moving fast now, grabbing the stretcher again, lifting it with a controlled surge of strength that burned through every muscle in his body, and he turned toward the back of the cabin. Molly, he said. The dog was already moving. He reached the rear window, kicking out the lower frame in one sharp motion, wood splintering outward, creating just enough space to get through, and cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth, and something else. Smoke. Daniel froze for half a second. Then he understood. They weren't just surrounding the cabin. They were preparing to burn him out. Outside, a faint crackle began to build. Fire catching. Spreading. Daniel's grip tightened on the stretcher. Time was gone. Completely gone. And as the first thin line of smoke curled past the window frame, one thought hit him with absolute force. This wasn't about chasing them anymore. This was about surviving what they had already decided to finish. The smell of smoke thickened fast, not slow and creeping the way a natural fire would spread through damp forest, but aggressive, deliberate, fueled with intent, and Daniel Cross felt the urgency spike through him like a shockwave because fire changed everything. It erased cover, it erased time, it turned any position into a trap, and the moment he saw that first curl of grey pushing through the broken window frame, he knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't trying to force him out into a fight, they were trying to force him into a choice. Burn inside, or run into their guns. Daniel's jaw tightened, his mind snapping through options at a speed that left no room for hesitation, and every single one of them led to the same conclusion. There was only one path forward, and it was going to hurt. We're moving now, he said, not loud, not panicked, just absolute, because anything less would fracture the moment. The woman's eyes flickered open again, barely, her awareness fragile but present enough to understand the tone if not the full words, and Molly shifted instantly, rising from beside the girl, her body angling toward the back window, already anticipating the movement before Daniel even stepped. Outside, the crackling grew louder, sharper, flames catching faster than they should have in a forest still soaked from the storm, and that told Daniel something else, accelerants. They had planned this. Brought it with them. This wasn't a search anymore. This was execution. He adjusted his grip on the stretcher, bracing his stance for what came next, and then he moved. Fast. Controlled. No hesitation. He lifted the stretcher higher, angling it toward the broken window, calculating clearance in a single glance, then drove forward, pushing through the frame as wood splintered further under the pressure, the edges scraping against the stretcher but not stopping it, not slowing it, and cold air hit his face hard as he stepped out into the back of the cabin. Smoke was already curling around the structure, thin but growing, drifting low across the ground, and Daniel didn't pause to look at it, didn't waste a second assessing the fire because he already knew what it meant. It was closing, and fast. Go, he snapped, and Molly surged ahead into the trees behind the cabin, not waiting, not questioning, her movement immediate and purposeful, creating space, clearing path. Daniel followed, every step heavy under the weight, his muscles screaming now, pushing beyond what they should have been capable of, but he didn't slow, because slowing meant dying, and that wasn't an option he accepted. Behind him, voices shouted again, louder now, closer, and then a shot cracked through the smoke, the bullet slicing through branches above his head, too close, too precise. They had repositioned. Covered the back. Daniel angled sharply left, breaking the line of sight, using the thickest part of the forest for cover, his path no longer direct but unpredictable, forcing them to adjust, to chase instead of intercept. Another shot. This one hit the ground just behind his heel, spraying dirt upward, and Daniel pushed harder, ignoring the burn in his lungs, the strain in his arms, the weight threatening to drag him down with every step. Molly appeared ahead again, circling back briefly, checking on him, then moving forward again, her pace relentless, her focus unbroken, guiding him through terrain that grew denser, tighter, forcing him to weave between trees, to duck under branches, to step over fallen trunks without losing balance. The forest closed around them, swallowing the clearing, the cabin, the fire, until all that remained was movement and sound, the pounding of his boots, the rasp of his breathing, the distant shouts growing fainter but not gone. Then something changed. The ground shifted. Dropped slightly. Became softer. Wet. Daniel felt it immediately, a low basin, water pooling from the storm, mud deeper here, thicker, harder to move through. Not ideal. But maybe, useful. He slowed just enough to adjust, stepping carefully now, angling toward the lowest point, the water reflecting dull grey beneath the heavy sky, and Molly stopped at the edge of it, turning back toward him, waiting. Daniel reached her, his chest rising and falling hard now, sweat mixing with rain and smoke, his arms trembling slightly under the strain, but still holding, still steady. He looked at the water. Then at the forest behind them. Then at Molly. Tracks, he muttered. The dog's ears flicked. We lose them here. He stepped forward into the water, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground beneath, cold seeping through instantly, but he didn't react, didn't hesitate, moving deeper, angling along the edge instead of straight across, breaking their trail, confusing direction, forcing anyone following to slow down, to search instead of pursue. Molly moved beside him, matching his path perfectly, her paws barely disturbing the surface compared to his heavier steps, her body still alert, still scanning, even now. They moved like that for several minutes, silent except for the sound of water shifting around them, until Daniel finally angled back toward higher ground, climbing out slowly, carefully, ensuring the trail behind them was as broken as possible. He paused for the first time since leaving the cabin, just for a second, just long enough to listen. No voices. No footsteps. No immediate pursuit. Not gone. But delayed. He exhaled slowly, a controlled release of tension, and then looked down at the stretcher. The girl was still breathing, shallow but steady. The woman, weaker now, her face pale, her breathing thinner, fading. Time was running out for her. Fast. Daniel's jaw tightened again. Stay with me, he said quietly, though he didn't know if she could hear him anymore. He looked ahead. His cabin was no longer an option. Burned. Compromised. Known. He needed somewhere else. Somewhere hidden. Somewhere defensible. And then he remembered. An old ranger outpost. Miles east. Abandoned years ago, but still standing, still isolated, still unknown to anyone who didn't know the land the way he did. It was a risk. Distance. Terrain. Unknown condition. But it was the only real option left. He shifted his grip again, forcing his body to respond despite the fatigue building dangerously now, and looked at Molly. We're not done yet, he said. The dog didn't need the words. She was already moving. And as Daniel followed, carrying everything that now depended on him, one thought settled deep, sharp, unshakable. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a fight he hadn't chosen, but one he was going to finish. The forest stretched endlessly in front of Daniel Cross, but it no longer felt like an escape, it felt like a battlefield that had chosen him again, pulling him deeper into something he could no longer walk away from, and as he moved through the cold, damp terrain with the stretcher biting into his hands and shoulders, every step carried more than weight, it carried consequence, because now this wasn't just about getting out alive. It was about what came after, what these men would do if he failed, and what kind of man he would be if he let them finish what they started. The ranger outpost wasn't close, and Daniel knew that every minute mattered, the woman's breathing growing thinner with each passing second, her life slipping quietly toward a line that once crossed couldn't be reversed, and he could feel it, the subtle change in her weight, the way her body responded less, the way silence began to take more space where breath used to be. "Stay with me," he said again, his voice quieter now but heavier, carrying something deeper than command, something closer to a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Molly stayed at his side the entire way, her pace unwavering, her focus absolute, and more than once she darted ahead and back again, scanning, checking, guiding, her loyalty no longer just instinct but something earned, something forged in the shared urgency of survival, and Daniel realized without fully thinking it that he trusted her, completely. That realization hit harder than expected, because trust was something he had buried long ago, something he had learned to live without, something that had only ever led to loss when he allowed it back in. But not this time. Not here. Not with her. The terrain shifted again as they moved east, climbing slightly, the trees thinning just enough to let a dull grey light filter through the clouds above, and finally, through the branches, Daniel saw it. The outpost. Small. Weathered. But standing. Hope, fragile, dangerous, but real, cut through the exhaustion like a blade, and Daniel pushed harder, his body responding to that single focus, that single destination, even as everything inside him screamed to stop, to rest, to give in to the fatigue that had been building for hours. Almost there, he muttered, and this time it wasn't just for himself. He reached the structure, kicking the door open with controlled force, stepping inside quickly, scanning, clearing, and finding what he needed, shelter, space, and most importantly, time. He lowered the stretcher carefully, his hands finally releasing their grip as he dropped to one knee beside the woman, immediately checking her pulse again, and his chest tightened as he felt how faint it had become. Too faint. Too close. "No, no, stay with me," he said, his voice breaking slightly despite everything, despite the control he had held for so long, because this moment was too familiar, too close to something he had lost before, something he had never forgiven himself for. He moved quickly, doing everything he could, pressure, stabilization, everything his training demanded, but deep down, he already knew. The woman's eyes opened one last time, barely, her gaze finding his with a clarity that hadn't been there before, like the fog had lifted just enough for her to see what mattered. "My daughter," she whispered. Daniel leaned closer, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "She's here. She's safe." A faint, fragile smile touched her lips, and then her eyes shifted slightly, finding Molly, who had moved close again, pressing gently against her side, refusing to leave, and something passed between them, recognition, gratitude, love, all of it compressed into a single, silent moment. "Take care of her," the woman breathed. Daniel didn't hesitate. "I will." The promise came out before he could question it, before he could weigh it, because some things didn't allow hesitation. Some things demanded certainty. The woman's eyes closed slowly, her breathing softening, and then stopping. The silence that followed was different from the forest's silence. Heavier. Final. Daniel stayed there for a long moment, unmoving, his hands still resting where her pulse had been, his mind quiet in a way it hadn't been in years, not empty, but still, like something inside him had shifted, something old breaking and something new taking its place. Molly let out a soft, low whine, pressing closer to the woman, her body still, her presence unwavering even in loss, and Daniel closed his eyes briefly, not to escape the moment, but to accept it, to carry it forward instead of letting it bury him the way things used to. Then he moved. Because there was still one life left to protect. The girl stirred weakly, her eyes opening slowly, confusion and fear flickering through them as she looked around, trying to understand where she was, what had happened. "Mama," she whispered. Daniel felt the weight of that word like a physical blow, but he didn't look away, didn't hesitate, because she deserved truth, even if it hurt. He leaned closer, his voice soft but steady. "She made sure you were safe," he said. The girl's eyes filled with tears, her small body trembling as the understanding came, slow but undeniable, and Molly moved instantly, pressing close against her, offering warmth, comfort, something to hold onto in the middle of loss, and the girl wrapped her arms weakly around the dog's neck, holding on as if it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Daniel watched them for a second, something deep inside him tightening and then, settling. Not breaking. Not collapsing. Settling. Because this time, he wasn't too late. This time, someone was still alive. The sound came from outside before he could say anything else. Faint. Distant. But unmistakable. Engines. Not the men. Different. He moved to the window quickly, looking out through the broken glass, and in the distance, through the trees, he saw it, vehicles. Rangers. Or law enforcement. Someone responding. Someone coming. Backup. For the first time since this began, they weren't alone anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his body finally easing just slightly, not gone, but no longer crushing, and he turned back to the girl and Molly, his voice quieter now, but carrying something new. Something stronger. "It's over," he said. And this time, it was true. Days later, when the forest had settled and the storm's scars began to fade, when the men who had hunted them were taken into custody and the truth of what they had been after started to surface, a hidden cache, something valuable enough to kill for, something the girl's father had found and paid the price for, Daniel Cross stood at the edge of that same clearing outside his cabin, now partially rebuilt, watching the wind move through the trees again, listening to the forest breathe in a way that finally felt natural. The girl stood beside him, smaller than everything around her, but stronger than she had been, Molly at her side as always, never leaving, never wavering, and Daniel looked at them both, the weight of everything that had happened settling into something he could carry now, not as a burden, but as purpose. He had come out here to disappear. To escape. To live quietly, alone, untouched by the world that had taken too much from him. But that life was gone now. And in its place, something else had taken root. Responsibility. Connection. Redemption. The girl looked up at him, her voice soft but steady. "You stayed." Daniel met her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel it fully. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I did." Molly pressed gently against both of them, bridging the space, anchoring them together, and as the wind moved through the trees and the forest came back to life around them, Daniel Cross realized something he hadn't thought possible anymore. Not all storms destroy. Some storms bring you back to who you were meant to be. Oza, his eyes scanning every angle, every shadow, every possible threat. "Hello," he called, his voice low but clear. No answer. Only the soft creak of wood and the distant drip of water. He reached the door and paused, listening again, then pushed it open slowly. The interior was dim, the light barely reaching inside, but what he saw immediately told him everything he needed to know. This place hadn't been abandoned. Not recently. There were signs of life, blankets, supplies, a small stove, a lantern, but everything was in disarray, like it had been left in a hurry or interrupted. And then, something else. Blood. Not a lot. But enough. On the floor near the back wall. Daniel stepped inside, his movements controlled but urgent now, scanning quickly, and that's when he saw her. A woman. Slumped against the wall, partially hidden behind a fallen chair, her body still, her face pale beneath streaks of dirt and dried blood. Daniel's breath caught for a split second, then he moved, crossing the room in 2 quick steps, lowering the girl carefully onto a blanket before dropping to his knees beside the woman. "Hey," he said, his voice sharper now. "Can you hear me?" No response. He checked her pulse. Faint. But there. Alive. Barely. A deep wound along her side, crudely bandaged, soaked through. She had been bleeding for hours. Maybe longer. Daniel's jaw tightened as he worked quickly, opening his kit again, assessing, stabilizing, his hands moving with the same precision they always had, but inside, something was shifting, something he couldn't fully control anymore. Because now it wasn't just a rescue. It was a pattern. A family. Hunted. Injured. Left to die. The German Shepherd moved into the cabin quietly, going straight to the woman, pressing its head gently against her arm, a soft whine escaping it, and in that moment, everything clicked. "You were protecting them," Daniel whispered, looking at the dog. Both of them. The dog didn't move. Didn't look away. It stayed there, loyal, unwavering, even now. And as Daniel worked to keep the woman alive, one thought settled into him with absolute certainty. Those men weren't just searching. They were finishing something. And now, he was part of it. The cabin felt smaller with every second that passed, like the walls themselves were closing in around the fragile space between life and death, and Daniel Cross worked with a focus so absolute it erased everything else, his hands steady as he cut away the soaked bandage from the woman's side, revealing the wound beneath, deep and ragged, not clean, not accidental, and the sight of it confirmed what he already knew. This had not been caused by the storm, this was deliberate, violent, and meant to kill. He pressed fresh gauze firmly against it, applying controlled pressure, his movements efficient but careful, aware that too much force could push her further into shock, while too little would cost her the blood she no longer had to spare. The girl stirred faintly beside him, a soft, broken sound escaping her lips as if her body could feel what was happening even through the fog of exhaustion, and the German shepherd shifted immediately, moving from the woman to the child and back again, torn but vigilant, refusing to leave either one for long, its loyalty dividing itself without hesitation, as if it understood that both lives hung on the same thin thread. "Stay with me," Daniel murmured to the woman, though her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow and uneven, each breath a fragile fight against the weight pulling her under. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small vial, checking the dosage quickly before administering it, something to stabilize, to buy time, not a solution but a chance, and as he worked, his mind ran through possibilities with ruthless clarity: distance to his cabin, terrain conditions, estimated travel time with 2 injured civilians, risk of pursuit, probability of the men returning sooner than expected. The answer wasn't good. Not even close. He couldn't carry both of them at once. Not through this terrain. Not fast enough. Not safely. Which meant he needed another solution. And he needed it now. The woman's eyes flickered suddenly, a faint movement beneath heavy lids, and Daniel leaned closer, his voice lowering. "Can you hear me?" For a second, nothing happened. Then, a breath, sharper than the others, and her eyes opened just enough to catch the light, unfocused at first, then slowly, painfully, they found him. Fear came first. Instinctive. Immediate. Her body tried to move, to pull away, but the pain stopped her before she could even shift. "Easy," Daniel said quickly. "You're safe. I'm not with them." Her gaze searched his face, trying to read something, anything that would tell her whether to trust him, and Daniel held still, letting her see what she needed to see, not words, not promises, just the truth in his eyes, the kind that couldn't be faked under pressure. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice barely more than air. Daniel turned his head slightly. "She's here," he said. "She's alive." The woman's breath hitched, a fragile, desperate relief breaking through the pain, and her eyes shifted weakly toward where the girl lay, wrapped and still, the German shepherd pressed protectively against her side. A tear slipped down the woman's temple, cutting through the dirt. "Molly," she breathed. Daniel looked at the dog again, and this time there was no doubt. Molly wasn't just a companion. She was theirs. Family. Protector. Survivor. "You hid her," Daniel said quietly. The woman's eyes flickered again, faint strength pushing through the exhaustion. "They followed us," she whispered. "From the road, they knew," her voice broke, the effort of speaking pulling too much from her already weakened body. Daniel leaned closer. "Who are they?" he asked, his tone calm but urgent. Her lips parted, but the answer didn't come immediately. Her eyes drifted, unfocused again, slipping toward the edge, and Daniel felt a sharp frustration cut through him, not at her, but at time, at the situation, at everything that had led to this moment where answers were just out of reach. "Stay with me," he said again, firmer this time. "I need you to focus." Her gaze snapped back weakly, clinging to him. "They want something," she managed. "Something my husband found." Daniel's chest tightened slightly. "Where is he?" The question hung for a second too long. The woman's eyes filled again, and this time the answer didn't need words. Daniel felt it anyway. "Dead," she whispered, confirming what her silence had already said. The words settled heavy in the room, adding weight to everything else, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw something flash through his mind, another face, another loss, another moment where he had been too late, and he forced it down immediately, because this wasn't that moment. Not yet. Not if he moved fast enough. Listen to me, he said, shifting his tone, grounding it. Those men are going to come back. We need to move before they do. The woman's breathing hitched again, fear returning stronger now that the reality had been spoken out loud. I can't, she whispered. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't tell her she could. He already knew she couldn't walk far. Not like this. Not without help. He looked around the cabin quickly, his mind searching, adapting, and then he saw it, a wooden door leaning against the wall, partially broken but still solid enough to hold weight. Improvised stretcher. It wouldn't be perfect. It wouldn't be easy. But it might be enough. He moved quickly, dragging the door into position, testing its strength, adjusting it with strips of fabric and rope from his pack to create makeshift grips. The German Shepherd watched him closely, its head tilting slightly as if trying to understand, but not interfering, trusting the process even without knowing the outcome. Daniel turned back to the woman. I'm getting you out of here, he said. Both of you. She shook her head weakly. Too slow, Daniel met her gaze, steady, unyielding. It's fast enough, he said. And something in his voice made her stop arguing. Because it wasn't hope. It wasn't reassurance. It was certainty. The kind that didn't leave room for doubt. He moved to the girl first, lifting her carefully and placing her onto the makeshift stretcher, securing her gently but firmly so she wouldn't shift during movement, then returned to the woman, sliding one arm behind her back, supporting her as he eased her down beside the child, positioning them both in a way that balanced the weight as much as possible. The German Shepherd stepped closer, pressing against the edge of the stretcher, its body tense again, ready, waiting. Daniel grabbed the front grips, testing the weight. Heavy. More than ideal. But manageable. He had carried worse. Through worse. He straightened slowly, lifting the stretcher off the ground, adjusting his stance until the balance felt right, and then he looked at the dog. Stay close, he said quietly. Molly didn't hesitate. She moved to his side immediately. Daniel took one last look at the cabin, at the blood on the floor, at the life that had been shattered inside it, and then he turned, stepping back into the forest. The weight pulled at his muscles instantly, the uneven ground making every step a calculation, every shift of balance a risk, but he didn't slow, didn't hesitate, because now there was no time left for anything but movement. And somewhere behind them, deep in the forest, the silence was starting to break again.